Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene.
On September 14th, 2016, at 10:15 in the morning, a group of foresters noticed an unnatural object in a remote part of the Val Grande National Park. On an old beech tree growing on the edge of a steep rock face, about 30 meters above the ground, an elongated object that looked like a giant cocoon was moving in the wind. Through the binoculars, we could see that it was an expensive winter sleeping bag that had been tied up with ropes and had been hanging there for a long time. None of those present knew that this dirty, faded fabric contained a terrifying answer to the disappearance of British architect George Simmons, who had been searched for unsuccessfully for a year. It wasn't just a find, it was a grave in the air, deliberately hung where no one was supposed to find it. The story of one of the most puzzling disappearances of the last decade began on August 14th, 2015. On that hot summer's day, a man whose name would later become known throughout Europe stepped onto the platform of the small Italian village of Malesco, located on the border between Switzerland and Italy. He was a 28-year-old British architect named George Simmons. Tall and athletic, he looked like a man who knew exactly where he was going. George hadn't come here for a pizza or a museum tour. He had escaped the stifling London office routine, the endless designs and deadlines, to find peace in a place that has been called Europe's last wilderness. The Val Grande National Park is not just a forest. It is a labyrinth of almost 60 square miles with no roads, no settlements, and above all, no cell phone reception. It was this remoteness that attracted Simmons. He was an experienced hiker who had already completed challenging routes in Scotland and the Pyrenees. His goal was the Sentiero Bouvet, a legendary and dangerous trail that runs along sharp, razor-sharp mountain ranges. It is a route for loners, where a mistake can be fatal. The last time George was seen alive was on August 15th, 2015, at about 9 o'clock in the evening. He went to a local restaurant, the Trattoria Alpina, on the outskirts of town to have dinner before heading out. The owner of the restaurant, who later gave evidence to the Carabinieri, remembered the British man very well. According to him, George seemed focused and calm. He laid out a detailed topographical map with a scale of 1 to 25,000 on a wooden table and carefully studied the relief, running his finger over the contour lines. The witness also described in detail the tourist's equipment, which later played an important role in the search. George was wearing professional trekking boots with hard soles, and next to him on the bench was a backpack with a bright orange storm suit. This color was not chosen at random. It serves as a beacon for rescuers in the mountains. After finishing his coffee, George paid in cash, politely said goodbye, and went out into the night. The next morning, at 6 o'clock, he parked his rental car in the public parking lot at the entrance to the reserve. The surveillance cameras caught a lone figure with a large rucksack walking towards Lone Valley. It was the last footage to show George Simmons alive. He crossed the invisible border of civilization and disappeared into the green abysses of the Val Grande. The alarm began 5 days later. On the 20th of August, 2015, George was supposed to contact his family in London and return the car to the rental agency. But the phone went silent, and the car was still in the parking lot, covered in dust. The worried parents notified the Italian police, and 4 hours later, a large-scale search operation was launched. It was a real challenge for the rescue services. The Val Grande is an area of deep gorges, steep cliffs, and impenetrable beech forests that hide the land from the sun, even at midday. 2 helicopters took to the air and began combing the rocky ridges of the Cima della Lurasca, where George's route would likely pass. Dozens of volunteers and dog teams with search dogs worked on the ground. The situation was greatly complicated by the weather. On August 22nd, the second day of the active search, a strong storm moved across the valley. The sky darkened, and it began to rain, turning dry mountain trails into muddy streams. Visibility dropped to 0. The helicopters were forced to return to base, and the ground teams had to seek shelter. It rained continuously for 48 hours, mercilessly obliterating any traces that the missing architect might have left behind. When the weather finally cleared, there was little hope of finding George alive. The only clue was found on the 3rd day of the search, August 23rd. A group of volunteers investigating the bed of the Rio Val Grande found a small object on a rocky bank. It was a professional portable water filter. An expert examination confirmed that it belonged to Simmons, as his fingerprints remained on the body. The discovery of the filter near the river confused the investigation. This location was a considerable distance from the planned route along the ridge. Why did the experienced tourist descend into the gorge? There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, and no clothing. There was also no sign of slipping or falling on wet rocks. The filter just lay there, as if it had been accidentally dropped or deliberately left behind. The search continued for another 2 weeks. The rescuers examined every cave, grotto, and crevice within a 5-mile radius of the site, but Valgrande remained silent. There was neither the body nor any new clues. On September 5, 2015, the active phase of the operation officially ended. The police presented an official version that satisfied the bureaucratic apparatus, but not the hearts of the parents. According to the investigators, there had been an accident. Allegedly, George Simmons slipped and fell into a raging river while trying to fetch water during the oncoming storm. According to authorities, his body was swept by the current into one of the many underwater siphons, or trapped underwater in an inaccessible crevice. The case was classified as a missing person. The folder with the documents went into the archives, and George Simmons' name was added to the sad list of wildlife victims. His car was moved out of the parking lot, and it became quiet in the mountains again. It seemed as if the story ended with a tragic but trivial accident. None of the rescuers packing their gear that September had any idea that George hadn't fallen into the river. He was much closer than they could have imagined, and while the police were writing their final report, his fight for life had only just begun, as he was watched not only by wild animals, but also by the watchful, crazed eyes of a human. Exactly 1 year has passed. The forest seemed to have swallowed up any hope of a solution to the problem for good. Valgrande knows how to guard its secrets, hiding them in deep crevices and under the roots of centuries-old trees. On September 14, 2016, the silence of the reserve was broken by the voices of people. It was neither a search party nor tourists, but a team of foresters carrying out a routine hygiene check in the Valpogallo sector. This is one of the most inaccessible and wildest parts of the park, rarely entered by humans. There are no marked trails and no mobile communication. The group was led by head forester Marco Venturi. According to his report, the weather was clear that morning, visibility was perfect, and the temperature was around 65 degrees Fahrenheit. At 10:40 minutes in the morning, the group moved along a steep slope to check the condition of the beech forest for pests and diseases. The terrain is a dangerous jumble of rocks and old trees with roots clinging to rocks over a precipice more than 300 meters deep. One of the foresters, a young apprentice named Giovanni, stopped to catch his breath and check his route against the map. Glancing up, he noticed something unusual in the dense foliage of an old beech tree growing at the edge of the cliff. 20 feet above the ground, in the branches of the thick boughs, he could make out a strange, dark spot. It didn't fit into the usual color palette of the autumn forest. Giovanni called for the group leader. Marco Venturi adjusted his binoculars and looked at the object for several minutes. He would later write in his report that at first he thought it was an old nest of a large bird of prey, or a boulder stuck in the branches that had rolled down from above. But the outline was too smooth, too artificial. It was an elongated object that looked like a giant cocoon pulled tightly against the trunk. It swayed in the wind and made a barely audible creaking sound that sent shivers down the ranger's spines. Then Turi realized that it would be impossible to get to the spot without special equipment, and radioed for a team with climbing gear. They had to wait almost 3 hours. After 14 hours and 15 minutes, 2 trained specialists began to climb the tree. The bark of the beech was smooth and covered in moss, and the tree itself grew at a dangerous angle over the precipice. Any mistake could cost their lives. As the climber approached the object, he sent down a message that sent everyone into a frenzy. It wasn't garbage. It was an expensive winter sleeping bag, a professional model designed for extremely low temperatures. The fabric, once bright blue or black, was now dirty gray, faded by sun and rain, and covered with a layer of green moss and bird droppings. The sack was wrapped with thick nylon ropes cut deep into the soft fabric to secure it to the trunk. The knots looked intricate and professional, as if they wouldn't untie themselves even in 100 years. The move took almost an hour. The load was heavy and uncomfortable. The climbers had to cut some of the ropes to free the cocoon from the captivity of the branches. When the object was finally lowered by the ropes, it hit the trunk with a thud. A prepared tarpaulin was already waiting for him on the ground. As soon as the sleeping bag touched the ground, the foresters smelled a specific sweet odor of decay that could not be mistaken for anything else. The forest fell silent. Even the birds no longer seemed to be singing. Marco Venturi, who was wearing gloves, approached the find. An external examination confirmed his suspicions. There was a corpse inside. The outline of a human figure was clearly visible through the dirty fabric. The sleeping bag was wet and heavy, soaked with the moisture of many seasons. Carefully, so as not to damage the contents, the rangers began to open the cocoon. The fabric was difficult to open. The zipper was rusted and could no longer be moved. They had to use a knife to cut the fabric along the seam. When the edges of the sleeping bag opened, the onlookers were presented with a gruesome sight. Inside were mummified human remains. The body was completely desiccated. The skin resembled parchment and densely covered the bones of the skull and arms. The deceased's clothing was surprisingly well preserved. He was wearing the same bright orange storm jacket that was seen at every police station in the region a year ago. The man's arms were folded calmly across his chest in a pose of eternal peace, his fleshless fingers still clutching the fabric of the fleece jacket. But the detail that made the experienced forester Venturi turn pale was not in the body itself. As he examined the sleeping bag, he noticed the position of the zipper. The mechanism was at its highest point and closed the cocoon tightly with the hood. But the worst thing was that the tongue of the zipper was on the inside. The sleeping bag was closed from the inside. The person lying inside had sealed himself off from the outside world and cut off the way back. Preliminary identification took place on the spot. In the inside pocket of the orange jacket, they found a leather wallet that had hardly been affected by the moisture. It contained credit cards, some cash, and a driver's license. The photo on the document showed the smiling face of a young man who was full of life and energy. The name on the card left no doubt: George Simmons. The rangers stood in silence, gazing at the withered face of the man hundreds of people, helicopters, and dogs had been searching for. He had been here the whole time, just a few kilometers from the hiking trails, suspended between heaven and earth, in his own fabric coffin. The discovery answered the question of where, but raised an even more sinister question of how. How could a man with a broken leg, and the fact that the leg was injured became clear on first inspection of the unnatural curvature of the limb, manage to climb 20 meters up a slippery tree trunk? How had he managed to hang himself, using a complex system of knots, while still in the sack? And why had he zipped it up from the inside, leaving himself no chance of escape? The sun began to set behind the sharp peaks of the Val Grande, casting long shadows over the site of the horrific find. The body of George Simmons, who had been swaying in the wind for a year, now lay motionless on the ground. But his face, frozen into an eternal grimace, seemed to hold a secret more terrible than death itself. When Venturi looked at the zipper again, he noticed another small detail. The slider wasn't just pulled upwards. It was blocked from the inside with a piece of wire, as if someone wanted to make sure the bag didn't open accidentally. Friends, before we continue unraveling this tangle of creepy mysteries, I have a small request for you. Please subscribe to the channel, click the like button, and leave a comment below this video. It only takes a few seconds, but it's your activity that helps the YouTube algorithms to promote our content. It's the only way we can ensure that as many people as possible can see this story, and we can learn the truth together. And now back to the Verbania morgue, where autopsy results have turned a disappearance case into an investigation into one of the strangest crimes in Italian history. The body of George Simmons was in a mummified state, which made the pathologist's work a little more difficult. But the dry mountain air and the tightness of the sleeping bag preserved the tissue sufficiently for detailed analysis. The chief expert, Dr. Antonio Rossi, completed the autopsy on September 18, 2016. As he signed the final report, silence fell in the boardroom. The results of the autopsy stood in stark contrast to the logic of the preliminary investigation. The first and most shocking discovery was the time of death. George had officially disappeared in August 2015. The search teams had been looking for his body and had assumed that he had died from a fall or dehydration in the first few days. However, analysis of his bone tissue and stomach contents revealed the impossible. George's heart had stopped beating just 4 months after his disappearance. The estimated date of death was December 2015. That means George was alive while volunteers combed the woods and helicopters circled the cliffs. He breathed, ate, and slept somewhere nearby, while his family was already beginning to mourn their loss. The cause of his death was not, as previously assumed, a fall from the cliff. George Simmons died of severe hypothermia and extreme exhaustion. He slowly froze to death while he was still conscious. But as surprising as the time of death was, the next discovery caused genuine horror among the investigators. X-rays of his left leg showed signs of a serious injury. It was a complex spiral fracture of the tibia, an injury that is accompanied by unbearable pain and makes independent movement absolutely impossible. A person with such a fracture would not be able to walk 10 meters, let alone survive in the wild forest for 4 months. However, the bone has grown together. The X-ray clearly showed that a bone callus had formed. This indicated that the leg had been completely immobilized for at least 8 weeks after the injury. In addition, the bone had grown together anatomically correctly, without any dangerous displacement. That could only mean one thing. Someone had given George qualified medical care. Someone had set his leg, fitted him with a professional immobilization splint, and, above all, provided him with care, food, and water while he was bedridden. This fact completely invalidated the theory of the hermit's solitary death. Georg was not alone. The third detail that finally puzzled the investigation concerned the equipment. The forensic experts determined that the sleeping bag in which the body was found did not belong to Simmons. On the equipment list provided by his relatives was a modern, lightweight sleeping bag in a light color. The sleeping bag found was an old military model, used by the Italian army in the 1980s. You can't buy something like this in an ordinary tourist store. You can only find it in warehouses for decommissioned items. The ropes attracted particular attention. The sleeping bag was attached to a tree with a system of complicated C-knots and climbing loops. A rigging expert called in by the police came to the clear conclusion that it is physically impossible to fasten such a construction in a sleeping bag with a zipper. The knots were tied outside, by a person who had a lot of experience with ropes. This created an unsolvable paradox. George was locked from the inside. The zipper was inside the cocoon and locked in the up position. He had sealed himself off from the world. But someone else lifted him to a height of 3 meters and tied him so tightly to the trunk that the bag hung there for a whole year. The investigators were confronted with a crime that looked more like a brutal ritual than a simple murder. Inspector Marco Bianchi realized that someone had cared for George for 4 months, treating and feeding him, only to hang him from a tree and leave him to die of cold. As forensic experts began to closely examine the deceased's clothing to find at least some microparticles that would point to this mysterious, other face, they noticed a strange bulge in the chest area. There was something sewn into the inside pocket of the fleece jacket George was wearing under his jacket. After ripping open the seam, the expert pulled out a small object wrapped in plastic that could answer the question of where exactly the architect had spent those 4 months. The results of the forensic examination changed everything. The case, which began as a search for a missing tourist and then turned into an investigation into an accidental death, now officially became an investigation into kidnapping and manslaughter. Inspector Marco Bianchi, who led the investigation team in Verbania, understood the logic of the case. A broken leg doesn't heal itself in the wild forest. Someone applied a splint. Someone brought water. Someone fed George Simmons for 4 long months as he slowly died in obscurity. The police faced a new challenge. They no longer needed to look for the body. It was already in the morgue. Now they were looking for someone who had made the architect's last months of life a living hell, or for someone who had tried to save him but failed. The focus of the search operation shifted from combing the ravines to looking for apartments. The Val Grande is not only a forest, but also a historical area with many traces of the past. There are hundreds of ruins of old shepherds' huts, popularly known as baita. Most of them were abandoned after the Second World War and have long since become shapeless piles of stones overgrown with moss. However, some of these ruins continued to serve as a refuge for poachers, smugglers, or hermits who wanted to escape civilization. On September 25, 2016, the operation entered its active phase. The police used state-of-the-art technology, as it would have been too tedious and inefficient to comb such a difficult area on foot. Industrial drones equipped with highly sensitive thermal imaging cameras and cameras with multiple optical zoom were taken into the air. The operators methodically searched the Valpogallo sector and divided it into squares. The work progressed slowly. The stones, heated by the autumn sun, caused numerous thermal interferences, forcing the operators to check every suspicious signal. After 14 hours and 40 minutes, The drone operator, a police officer, noticed a weak but stable thermal anomaly. The signal was coming from a remote location about 3 kilometers from the tree where George's body was found. This location was safely shielded from view by a massive rocky outcrop that overlooked the ravine and formed a natural canopy. A closer camera zoom made it clear why this structure had not been noticed earlier during the visual search from the helicopter. It was a dilapidated stone building with walls that blended into the surrounding rocks. But the roof had been restored. Someone had carefully covered it with a modern tarpaulin and laid a layer of turf with grass and branches on top. This camouflage made the hut completely invisible to a normal observer from the air. Only a thermal imaging camera could detect the difference in temperature between the cold stone and the interior, where the heat was probably stored. Preparations for the raid took 2 days. The terrain was so inaccessible that the assault team had to use special climbing equipment to get into the ruins. On September 27, 2016, at 5:30 in the morning, an armed squad of carabinieri surrounded the site. In the morning mist, the hut looked like a backdrop for a gloomy movie. Dark, silent, fused with the rock. The group commander gave the signal. The soldiers approached the entrance. There was no door, but the passage was closed with a shield made of rough, unhewn planks. It was not locked. The policemen rushed in, ready to resist, but they were only met with silence. The hut was empty. There was semi-darkness inside. The only source of light was the narrow gaps between the stones of the masonry. The air was heavy and stale, smelling of smoke, dried herbs, old dust, and the specific odor of an unwashed human body. This smell indicated that someone had recently lived here, perhaps having left the accommodation only a few days before the police arrived. The furnishings were ascetic, almost primitive. In the middle of the room was a fireplace lined with stones, still containing gray ashes. Against the wall was a bed made of twisted branches, covered with dry ferns and animal skins. A crude table carved from a single tree trunk stood next to a single small window covered with a cloth. Inspector Bianchi, who had followed the assault team, immediately noticed the far corner of the room. There, on a large flat stone that served as a shelf, were objects that looked strange in this medieval setting. They were objects made of modern plastics, their bright colors standing out against the gray stone. The inspector moved closer and illuminated the corner with his flashlight. The first thing he saw was a jacket. It was a bright orange professional storm jacket from a brand popular with mountaineers. It was the same jacket George Simmons had been wearing on the day he disappeared, as witnesses and video footage proved. However, when the body was found in his sleeping bag, he was only wearing thermal underwear and a fleece jacket. He was not wearing a jacket. Now it was lying there, neatly folded, as if someone had carefully stored it. A rucksack stood next to it. It was half empty, but there were personal items in it. Spare socks, a flashlight without batteries, a compass. All this confirmed the worst suspicions. George was here. He lived in this stone grave. But the most important find was waiting on the table. Next to the homemade knife, its blade carved from a piece of car spring, was a small object in a black leather cover. It was a notebook. The corners were worn, and the pages were slightly swollen with moisture. Inspector Bianchi, who was wearing latex gloves, picked it up carefully. On the first page was a name in neat architect's handwriting, George Simmons. It was his diary, the voice of a dead man who could tell the truth about what had happened in that hut for 4 months. When the inspector opened the notebook in the middle, a dried leaf of a mountain plant fell out. Bianchi's gaze fell on the date of one of the entries, written in an uneven, shaky handwriting that didn't match the confident lines at the beginning. The text was written in pencil, pressed firmly into the paper, as if the author had written in a state of extreme excitement or anxiety. The first words the inspector read gave him the creeps, for they implied that the salvation George had found here was more terrible than death itself. The discovery of a black notebook in an abandoned cabin was a turning point in the investigation. It was not just a series of paper pages, but a real black box of a tragedy that had dragged on for 4 months. Inspector Marco Bianchi handed the document over to forensic graphologists and psychologists to reconstruct the chronology of events that turned an ordinary hiking trip into a psychological nightmare. The contents of the diary, deciphered by the experts, showed the investigators a picture more horrific than any physical torture. The first pages of the notebook were filled with the neat, small handwriting typical of the architect. George Simmons sketched the landscape, described the beauty of the Val Grande Valley, and his plans for the future. The last, normal, entry was dated August 17, 2015. In it, George wrote enthusiastically that he had found the perfect place to spend the night at the foot of the cliff, and that he wanted to climb the ridge the next morning. After that, there was emptiness. There was silence for more than 3 weeks. The next entry did not appear until September 14, 2015. The contrast to the previous pages was striking. The handwriting was broken, the letters jumped on the lines, and the pencil pen tore through the paper in several places due to excessive pressure. George described the moment of his fall. On August 18th, while trying to take a shortcut through a scree field, he lost his balance and tumbled down. The fall lasted only a few seconds, but ended with a terrible impact and a crunch in his left leg. The pain caused him to lose consciousness. When he regained consciousness, George found that he was unable to move. He remained in the stone trap for almost 2 days, losing hope, until a figure emerged from the fog. In his diary, Simmons does not mention the name of his rescuer. He only uses the nickname, the Man from the Mountain. This stranger, who possessed superhuman strength, pulled the wounded architect out of the ravine and carried him to his hut. The entries from September and early October are full of painful gratitude. George describes how the Man from the Mountains set his bone without anesthesia, causing Simmons to lose consciousness again. The rescuer fitted him with a homemade wooden splint and bound his leg tightly with strips of cloth. George called him his guardian angel, given to him by nature itself. He believed that this stern, silent man would help him into the valley, to the people, as soon as his leg had healed a little. But with the arrival of November, the tone of the recordings changes dramatically. Gratitude gives way to apprehension, and then clinging fear. George begins to realize that his rescue was not an act of mercy, but the beginning of an experiment. When the architect first spoke of returning home, the Man from the Mountain reacted aggressively. He explained that George was not ready, that civilization had poisoned his mind, and that the mountains had not yet accepted him. The rescuer turned out to be a fanatic with his own distorted philosophy. He preached the idea of radical purification through pain and complete isolation. In his diary, George describes his diet. The Man from the Mountains fed him bitter roots he had dug up in the forest, and a liquid soup made from small rodents. He claimed that hunger sharpens the mind. From time to time he forced George, who could barely stand on crutches, to go out into the cold and sit still for hours, to listen to the wind. Simmons wrote that he had become a prisoner, even though the doors of the hut had no locks. His prison was his own frailty and the geography. The cabin was located in what he called a blind spot, on a small plateau surrounded by steep walls on 3 sides and a precipice on the 4th. With a broken leg and no special equipment, it was physically impossible to escape. Any attempt to escape would have ended in death after 100 meters. The psychological pressure was unbearable. The Man from the Mountain gradually suppressed George's will and convinced him that his former life in London was an illusion that didn't matter. "He doesn't see me as a person, but as a blank from which something else can be carved," George wrote on November 22nd. The hermit's authority, his physical strength, and his insane confidence in his rightness had a hypnotic effect on the exhausted architect. In the December notes, the handwriting becomes very small and faint, indicating extreme exhaustion. The final pages are steeped in fatalism. George realizes that winter in the mountains won't give him a chance. But what frightens him most is not the cold, but the changed behavior of his overseer. The Man from the Mountains increasingly speaks of the final stage of purification, that George should merge with the forest and become a part of it. In an entry from the 3rd of December, Simmons recalls the hermit burning his shoes in a fire and laughing that he would no longer need them where he was going. The last lines of the diary are cut off mid-sentence. George writes that the Man from the Mountain brought ropes and told him to prepare for the big climb, even though his legs still hurt. The architect thought he was being led to the top of a cliff, but the truth was much more frightening. When Inspector Bianchi read these lines, he understood that the ascent the madman was talking about did not involve a return to Earth. But there was another detail in the diary. On the last page, separate from the main text, George managed to scribble a barely noticeable drawing. It was a sketch of a tattoo he had seen on his tormentor's forearm when he had rolled up his sleeves, a symbol well known to the locals and indicative of a particular person believed to be dead. With the help of a diary describing the tattoo and a psychological profile of the kidnapper, the police were able to narrow down their search. The investigators went to Chiconia, a tiny, almost deserted village known as the little capital of Val Grande Park. This place, with only a narrow road leading to it and no more than a dozen permanent residents, became the key to unraveling the identity of the man from the mountain. Using a sketch of the tattoo and a description of the suspect's behavior, Inspector Marco Bianchi finally managed to find a name. Old-timers recognized the man in the description as someone who had been considered dead or missing for many years. His name was Luca Rinaldi. He had once been one of the best climbers in the region, a charismatic instructor who knew every rock in the mountains. But in the winter of 2006, his life was divided into a before and an after. Exactly 10 years ago, Luca led a group of 5 experienced tourists on a winter tour. The gorge they had chosen was considered safe, but the weather in the mountains was unpredictable. A sudden avalanche buried the entire group under tons of snow. Only Luca managed to survive. Rescue workers found him 3 days later. He was sitting in the snow next to the bodies of his friends and was mute. After he was released from hospital, Rinaldi never returned to society. He burned his documents, sold his house, and went into the forest because he felt he had to atone as the guardian of these places. Since then, he has become a local legend, a ghost that frightens children. After receiving the name and a photo of a 10-year-old, the police sent out a manhunt to all the settlements around the national park. They didn't have to wait long. On October 5, 2016, at 9 o'clock in the morning, a call was received from the village of Ray, which lies on the northern border of the national park and is known for its pilgrimage church. Luigi Ferretti, the owner of a small store called Mercato dei Monti, reported that a man matching the description had entered his store. He only came down from the mountains very rarely, perhaps once every few months, when he ran out of vital supplies that were unobtainable in the forest. That morning he only needed salt and matches. When the raiding party, which was on duty in a nearby neighborhood, arrived, he was presented with a surreal sight. In the middle of a modern store, between shelves of colorful pasta and washing powder, stood a man who looked as if he had stepped out of the Stone Age. His long gray hair and beard had grown together into a felt-like ball. His clothing consisted of roughly tanned animal skins, over which he wore a dirty cloak made from an old army tarpaulin. The smell of smoke and game was so strong that other customers were afraid to approach him. The arrest operation went off without a single shot being fired. When 3 officers entered the store and pointed their guns at him, Luca Rinaldi didn't even bat an eyelid. He slowly placed a packet of salt on the counter, raised his arms, and looked at the police officers with eyes that showed no fear, only deep, all-encompassing tiredness. When the handcuffs were fastened to his wrists, he didn't say a word in his defense. Only when he was led outside, where a crowd of onlookers had already gathered, did he pause, look towards the mountain peaks, and say quietly but clearly a sentence that Inspector Bianchi would remember for the rest of his life. "I gave him the chance to become the wind. He was almost ready." The suspect's interrogation began that same day at 14 o'clock, at the Verbania police station. The interrogation room was saturated with the heavy smell of wood and unwashed bodies, which even the strong ventilation could not eliminate. Luca Rinaldi sat in a chair, as immobile as a stone. He refused to take a sip of water and stared at a single point on the wall. Inspector Bianchi chose the tactic of gentle pressure. He did not directly accuse Luca of the murder, but began to ask about George as a guest. This strategy worked. When he heard the architect's name, the hermit's eyes flashed fanatically for a moment. He spoke. His voice was hoarse from the long silence, and the words fell hard as stones. Luke did not deny that George had lived in his hut. He even spoke of it with pride. In his twisted view, it wasn't an abduction, it was a rescue. He claimed to have found George broken, not only physically but also mentally. According to Rinaldi, city life had turned the young architect into an empty shell, a man who had forgotten his true nature. "Do you think I'm a criminal?" asked Luca, looking the investigator straight in the eye for the first time. "I treated him. I shared my last meal with him. I fixed his leg when he was whimpering in pain. I taught him to listen to the silence that you people from the valleys drowned out with the noise of your cars." When the inspector asked about the cause of death and how George had ended up in a sleeping bag in a tree, Luke categorically denied that he had been murdered. He insisted that it had been George's voluntary decision. According to the hermit's version, after 4 months of preparation, George himself requested that the ancient rite of ascension be performed on him. Luke described this rite as the highest form of union with nature. It was about being left alone with the elements, no longer being on the ground, overcoming the fear of heights and cold. He wanted to be reborn, Rinaldi whispered. He wanted to feel what it was like to be a bird, to be part of the forest, not just a visitor. I just helped him take his place on the throne. The investigators listened to this confession with horror, realizing that they were dealing with a man whose reality was completely different from the usual one. For Luke, George's death was not a tragedy, but a failed transcendence, a transition that went wrong because of the weakness of the disciple himself. However, there was one detail in this story that troubled Inspector Bianchi. Luke claimed that George was ready for the exam, but as he described the preparations for the rite, the hermit inadvertently mentioned a technical nuance that made the investigators wonder. He told how he carefully prepared his equipment, how he chose the ropes, and how he tied special knots that hold stronger than steel. And this sentence about the knots was the moment when the investigators realized that what Luca called help was in fact a cold-bloodedly planned execution, the mechanisms of which they had not yet fully understood. On October 6, 2016, the atmosphere in the interrogation room of the Verbania police station was tense to the breaking point. It was clear to Inspector Marco Bianchi that Luca Rinaldi's philosophical ramblings about spiritual rebirth were just a cloak hiding the cold mechanics of a murder. The investigator placed two important documents on the suspect's desk: the report of a forensic rigging expert and the results of a laboratory analysis of the sleeping bag. Science was merciless to the hermit's mystical theories. An examination of the ropes proved that the knots securing the cocoon to the tree belonged to the category of complex climbing bindings that are physically impossible to tie from the inside. But the most important proof was the lightning. Under the microscope in the lab, forensic scientists found microscopic damage to the slider and remnants of a thin wire. This showed that the lock had not only been fastened, but had been deliberately locked from the outside. The person inside had no chance of opening the bag themselves. Under the pressure of these irrefutable facts, Luca Rinaldi's stony mask cracked. He stopped talking in riddles and began to tell the terrible truth about the events of early December 2015. This confession enabled the investigators to reconstruct the last days of George Simmons' life, minute by minute. By the beginning of winter, George's condition had improved significantly. Although his leg was still weak after a compound fracture, he was already able to bear a small amount of weight. Psychologically, however, the architect was devastated. The months of isolation, hunger, and constant psychological pressure from a fanatical overseer had turned him into a shadow of his former self. Luca, who was obsessed with the idea of creating a superhuman, decided it was time for the final test. He believed that George needed to undergo the ultimate experience of fear and cold in order to finally sever the connection to his former life. On December 3, 2015, Luke announced the beginning of the ascension ritual. Georg, who realized that something terrible was waiting for him, tried to resist, but the forces were unequal. Moreover, during a search of the hut, the police found an old 12-gauge hunting rifle. Although Luca claimed that he had not threatened him with it, the investigators suspected that the presence of the gun was the decisive argument that forced the limping and exhausted prisoner to give in. Rinaldi took George to an old beech tree growing over the cliff. There, he had prepared a system of blocks and poles in advance, a mechanism that would allow a person to lift a load far in excess of their own weight. It was this technical detail that explained how the hermit could lift a grown man to a height of 20 feet. Luke forced George to climb into a military sleeping bag that was lying on the ground, already attached to a lifting rope. Once the architect was inside, Rinaldi zipped it up to the top, leaving only a tiny opening for breathing. Then he did what the investigation classified as premeditated murder with extreme cruelty. He blocked the slider with wire and turned the warm sleeping bag into a straitjacket. George found himself in complete darkness and cramped conditions. Then he felt a jolt. The system of blocks worked, and his body slowly lifted off the ground. Lucas pulled him upwards until the cocoon reached a thick branch 3 meters above the ground. There, the hermit attached the rope and tied the pupil to the trunk so that he could not swing and hit the tree. According to Luke's plan, this test was to last 1 night. Georg was to hang over the abyss, face his fears, listen to the wind, and overcome the cold with his spirit. But nature made its own adjustments. On the night of the 4th of December, the temperature in the mountains dropped sharply. A stormy wind set in and brought the Arctic cold with it. The thermometer dropped to -15 degrees Celsius. Luke sat in his warm hut and listened to the wind howl. In his sick mind, he decided that this was a sign. He thought that nature itself was testing George, and that it would be weakness to interrupt the test now. He must be enlightened, he kept telling himself. Instead of taking the prisoner down in the morning, he left him hanging. A day passed, then a night. George, immobile in his tight cocoon, could not keep warm by moving. His cries for help were drowned out, if at all, by the roar of the wind in the ravine. The cold slowly penetrated through the layers of clothing and insulation. The hypothermia initially caused uncontrollable shivering, then hallucinations, and finally a fatal sleep. Just 3 days later, on the 6th of December, Luca Rinaldi returned to the tree. The storm had subsided and the forest was dead silent. When he reached the cocoon and touched it, he realized that nothing was moving inside. When he opened the lock, he saw George's frozen face. He was dead. At this point, the hermit's logic did a final, horrifying somersault. Instead of being horrified at what he had done, lowering the body down and informing the authorities, or at least burying it in the ground, Luke decided it was a success. In his warped reality, George hadn't died. He became part of the forest, an eternal sentinel. "I couldn't put him in the dirt," Luke said during the interrogation. "He belonged in heaven." Rinaldi zipped up again, pulled the knots even tighter, and climbed down to the ground. He left the body hanging from a branch and turned the old beech tree into an airy tomb. He removed the ladder and the blocks to cover all traces of how George had gotten there and returned to his life, certain that he had done the right thing. The investigators listened to this story and could hardly contain their emotions. They now knew everything. How a broken leg healed only for its owner to die in a horrible trap. How the hope of rescue turned into months of captivity. And how one man's crazy idea cost another man his life. But there was one more detail that Luca mentioned almost in a whisper at the very end of the interrogation. He said that before he left that last morning, he had placed something in dead George's hand through the fabric of the sack, an object that would serve as an entrance ticket to the other world. This detail made Inspector Bianchi shudder, because during the first examination of the body, the experts had indeed found a strange, small object in Simmons' stubby fingers, the meaning of which had remained unclear, but which now took on an ominous symbolism. The trial of Luca Rinaldi began on November 15, 2016, in the city of Verbania. The sessions were held behind closed doors, with the press and the public excluded. This decision was made by the judge, taking into account the nature of the crime and the defendant's mental state. The lawyers and prosecutors signed documents on the non-disclosure of details related to the defendant's delusions, so as not to turn the tragedy into a tabloid circus. On December 20, 2016, the verdict was announced. The court declared Luca Rinaldi insane. A 6-week psychiatric examination revealed a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia with a messianic complex, which had been exacerbated by a decade of complete social isolation. In his closing statement, which was later leaked to the press by an anonymous source, Luca showed no remorse. He looked right through the judge and quietly repeated that judges are only shadows who do not understand the language of the wind, and that he had only helped George to find his true path. Rinaldi was committed for compulsory treatment in a high-security psychiatric hospital in the Emilia-Romagna region, where offenders with severe mental disorders are housed. In a room with padded walls and under the round-the-clock supervision of nurses, the former King of the Val Grande, who considered himself the master of life and death, completed his journey. In the spring, on April 7, 2017, as the snow began to melt in the valleys, George Simmons' parents arrived in Italy. It was their first and last visit to the place where their son had died. The trip was organized by the National Park Authority, which provided them with 2 experienced guides and a psychologist. The journey to the fateful tree in the Val Pogallo sector took more than 5 hours and was a strenuous walk. The elderly people walked in silence over steep slopes and rocky scree, trying to understand how their son felt as he was carried along the same path with a broken leg. When the group arrived, the forest was silent. The old beech tree growing over the precipice looked the same as it had 100 years ago, but now it was marked with the seal of death. The ropes and block system that Luke had used to hang George had long since been cut off as evidence by the forensic experts, but there were marks on the bark of the tree that time had not been able to erase. Deep, dark furrows from the cables, cut almost a centimeter deep into the wood. The tree tried to heal these wounds by releasing resin that looked like frozen tears, but the scars remained forever. George's father stepped up to the trunk and placed his hand on the rough bark, right where his son's head had probably hit in his last moments. The mother couldn't get to the edge of the abyss. She stood some distance away and looked at the emptiness beneath the branches where her son had been rocking in the wind for 4 days. They hadn't left any flowers or wreaths there. That would have looked out of place in this wild place. They left only their pain and a silent prayer that was carried away by the mountain wind. In the meantime, the park management decided to put an end to the story of the killer hermit once and for all. Luca Rinaldi's hut, hidden in a rocky outcrop, began to attract unwanted visitors. The so-called tourists of darkness and mysticism lovers tried to find this place to take a selfie in front of the madman's hiding place. This posed a danger, as the path was difficult and there was a risk of new accidents. On the 5th of May, 2017, a group of foresters, armed with sledgehammers and crowbars, arrived at the hut. On the instructions of the management, the building was razed to the ground. The stone walls, which had protected the shepherds for centuries and then became a prison for the British architect, were stripped to the ground. The stones were scattered on the hillside, the wooden beams burned, and the remains of the tarpaulin taken away by helicopter. The place where George wrote his diary and dreamed of being rescued no longer existed. A year later, bracken and brambles completely covered the ruins, leaving no indication that anyone had ever lived here. However, it turned out to be more difficult to destroy the memory than to destroy the walls. The story of the cocoon has become part of local folklore, a scary tale told in whispers around the campfire. The inhabitants of the surrounding villages say that Valgrande has changed. The forest, which once seemed simply wild, now appears hostile. Even today, many years after the tragedy, experienced mountain guides try to avoid the Val Pogallo area and choose other routes. And tourists who venture into the depths of the park admit to having a strange feeling. When they pass the ancient beech forests, when the sun hides behind the clouds and the wind begins to rustle in the treetops, they stop involuntarily. Their eyes are not focused on their feet, on the path, but upwards. They peer into the dense tangle of branches, searching for a dark, unnatural silhouette, slowly swinging over the abyss. George Simmons came here to find peace and conquer the Alps, but the mountains, embodied by one man's madness, would not let him go. They took him for themselves and made him part of the eternal, cold landscape. And although the architect's body has long rested in a London cemetery, the locals believe that part of his soul remains there, 20 feet high, chained forever to an old tree with invisible ropes. And sometimes, when the mist falls in the mountains, the foresters swear they hear not the creaking of a tree, but a soft, rhythmic sound, like a heavy object hitting a trunk, a sound that reminds them that some stories never end.